All right, folks, welcome to our second um, PowerPoint for the 332 class here. We're going to kind of take a one step closer of a look, get out of a little bit of the theory and sort of macro considerations that we discussed last week, and get a little bit closer into the topic area. I want to look at the different primary two types of um, jobs that we would receive as mixing engineers would be sessions that are recorded live instruments or sessions that are sequenced sort of in the box um, beats or synthesis drum machines um, where you're not using mics capturing instruments quite as much, or you may have a mixture of the two, which I think is also pretty common. Anytime you have recorded instruments, however, um, you're going to have the considerations that are a little bit more complex, even in a hybrid session, like I was talking about a second ago. What do you do when you receive live session or session files? And that's going to be what we are actually doing this week, of course. So I want to take you through the protocol to basically set up your workflow after having received session files. To that point, how to work effectively and efficiently, we'll recall, was one of the 7 things to make a great mixing engineer. Grouping is right up there at the top of the list of why efficiency is important. So we'll talk a little bit about that. And then making sure you stay on track. You remember that there's no such thing as a perfect mix, meaning that it's pretty rare for an engineer to get to the point and be like, they sit back and they, uh, kiss the air. Mwah! It's the perfect mix. I have done it. It is a masterpiece. You're never going to hear that unless you're dealing with someone who's crazy like me. Because of the fact that you just get deeper and deeper into these fine tuning adjustments, and ultimately it's really exterior forces like deadlines and budget for a professional mixer that are going to force it off of their desktop and get it down the line to the mastering engineer. We'll talk a little bit about how to deliver tracks to a mastering engineer. But this idea of fine tuning, recognizing the milestones you're shooting for so you can stay on course are all very important. Okay, so looking at the difference between recorded and sequenced music. Recorded music is a little bit more old school. It goes back to the very first recording of Edison saying, Mary had a little lamb, and even before that, I think about a decade before that, you've got a French guy, I forgot his name, Edouard Leon Scott of Martinville, who sang Au Clair de la Lune. But in any case, those are acoustic events that are transferred the acoustic energy into some sort of recording device. And so that is the ground level of how to do audio recording. But since digital technology, it's not the only avenue. So digital technology presents a virtual replication of that process, but it's much more controlled, and it's got its kind of pluses and minuses when it comes to the job of the mixing engineer. So in the old school, recorded version, the songwriting, the arranging, and the recording process, those are all separate steps with separate sort of professional folks involved, and it sprawls. There's a lot of people that have to be coordinated. The budgets go up, facilities go up, and so the cool thing about the sequenced model in the box style is that all of that is collapsed into production, right? So when you're putting together your production, your writing and the recording and the arranging, that's all basically done on the fly. And so they call it mix as you go, as compared to, when you're doing the recording phase of the old school model, the decisions about where to place microphones, if you're going to allow bleed, multiple instruments in one room and stuff, those have profound implications for the mixing engineer. You may not be able to treat those instruments separately if you've got bleed coming through those microphones. And so in that older model, recording decisions end up being or definitely influencing mixing decisions quite a bit. And so on the sequence side, once again, you kind of doing the mix, but not as a purposeful thing as you go. And so the result of that is that there are some pitfalls by not having a separate process where, like, okay, I'm just going to work on the mix. It is potentially faster and easier, but you've got to beware of actually arriving with an incomplete mix. If the mixing is happening, kind of as a byproduct of recording and assembling the beat, like the choice of the instruments and things, they may have effects that are preset. Oftentimes, synth sounds will have, preset reverb, for example, or different kinds of maybe a delay to make it sound awesome by itself. But then in the mix, it sounds kind of, it's a problem. And so if you're going to do, assemble beats in the box and stuff, when you choose your sounds, you want to choose, dry sounds and mono sounds so that when it comes time to mix it, you're not immediately facing an obstacle of wishing that you could undo that reverb or pan it to one side or the other because it's already stereo or has a stereo effect or something like that. And so the same goes for processing. It's easy to have an overcompressed mix, and so you don't want to add extra compression until the end for sure in a when you're recording in the box. When you start with received session files, it's professional practice to actually include notes. So some sort of text document that goes along with that identifies basic information surrounding the session, and then any preferences about that the mixing engineer should know about, potentially including reference information, or whether you want a wet or a dry vocal, or stereo placement on grand piano or whatever it may be, So always check for notes so that you can go in sort of heads up about how this stuff was recorded and what the intended effects may be. You want to audition all the files, so listen to everything, pull up your mix and edit windows in Pro Tools and, press the space bar and see what there is, You can, good time to solo stuff, mute stuff and pull it back around so that you can basically get a feel for what you're working with, the raw files. And then you can kind of do a quick rough mix just with the faders and get everything into a ballpark of, so you can hear it. Nothing sticking out or invisible, I guess. And then from there, it's good to step back from the whole situation and draw up your plan. And so going in with with some notes of your own that reflect, the impressions that you got from any notes that you got with the files, and then listening to the files themselves, and your understanding about, the message, what the message of the artist is, what anything that the record label may want, or if it's a self-producing artist, their manager, whatever. You should start getting your brain firing in a creative way about how, what's going to be the emotion delivered by this track, and what are the focal points that are going to be doing that, and how to properly bring those focal points into relief in a way that allows them to bring as much power and excitement to your track as possible. And then you'll want to, separate your creative versus your technical tasks. And so creative tasks are, anything that's going to impact the sound. And so, doing EQ, or bringing in your digital, your dynamic range processors, for example. But technical processes, that's going to be grouping, labeling, arranging your desktop, um, basic housekeeping to make sure that your workflow is as smooth as possible. When it comes to drawing up a plan, so we'll talk a little bit more about the technical and creative tasks here in a second. So drawing up a plan, so you want to identify the general steps, like grouping of instruments, for example. And then, do you have any effects or processing that would be useful for certain groups? Oftentimes, bass guitar or your bus for your drums, may benefit from a similar compression, so that they sort of gel together as a unit, as a rhythm unit. So that's one example. What order are you going to use to approach the mix? Are you going to start working, in the middle of the song, like with the most important parts first? Like start working on the chorus and then work outward to the verses and the intro, or just kind of go chronologically from front to back, by instrument, by group. There are a few different decisions to make there. And then, it's good to know how many mixes you're going to need. Is this intended for vinyl? If so, you're going to want to center the bass. Panned bass can be a problem with, when you inscribe sound waves into vinyl. You want to be careful about that because it can knock the needle around a little bit. However, the opposite is true for a club mix. You're going to want probably enhanced bass on that. If it's intended for radio, if it is, for radio, there'll be time considerations. You may have to bleep out language or mute out curse words that the FCC would use to, basically fine the station, and so the station wouldn't want to put it on the air. Those are highly compressed files, or the radio stations do a lot of compression themselves, so you'll want to send kind of a rawer mix with a more dynamic range to the radio station. Sometimes labels want to compare two different mixes, one with the voice up versus the voice down a little bit. So those are all part of your plan. The technical versus the creative tasks, we talked about a little bit a second ago. Creative tasks are going to affect the sound. Technical, however, going to keep your workflow in order and make sure you are efficient. And so, if you're using an outboard desk or console, which we are not in this class, but that's, you would want to make sure your board is in the zeroed position. You want to make sure that your tracks are laid out. Your similar types of instruments are grouped by location on your desktop, but also by color, for example. We'll work on doing that. Checking any phase issues, and then as we talked about, making sure everything's labeled and in order. So we talked about grouping a second ago. 5 approaches to grouping. And this is how you're taking all of the tracks, or not the tracks, but the tracks. So you get the session is all of the songs. The songs are tracks, and then within a given track, you're going to have files for all of the different instruments. And so how are you going to group those instruments? And so some popular ways include, putting so the RHM method, putting all your rhythm instruments close to each other and nearby, and treating them as a group, and then adding on your accompaniment harmony instruments like piano or rhythm guitar, and then your sort of who's conveying the melody, so lead guitar, vocal, for example. And so treating them as three different groups and then blending them together. You could start by importance. So if it's vocal driven song, or lead guitar and vocal, you want to start with those two instruments. Maybe it's you've got an 808 kick, bass drum sound, and you want to make sure that is knocking the speaker drivers out the wall. And so that's where you want to begin with. So you've got to decide, that's where you're making those focus decisions. What's actually the most important thing, and starting with that. Parallel importance. So number 5, if you identify the two most basic important groups or instruments and mix them first. And so for a popular music track that's got a full band in it, kind of the world I come from, doing roots music, early rock and roll or blues music, electric blues or even acoustic blues, taking the drum and the vocal and as the two most important sort of reference points within the song, and setting those up first and then moving inward towards so they kind of set the parameters, and then everything kind of falls within that. And so moving through the rest of the mix, when you've got those set up, kind of holding the mix together. Strategic approaches to groups and tracks. So we talked about by importance. So when you're actually getting the track together, and so this is how you're going to mix the song. We talked about starting in the chorus, or just going chronologically, going through a song from start to finish. And then you've got how to arrange a group. So sometimes it's multiple tracks or multiple microphones or files for one instrument. So drums is a really good example of that. You may have two overhead, 2 channels for overhead, a channel for kick, or 2 channels for kick, channel or 2 for snare, and then toms and cymbals. One way to approach that is to the OKS method. So overhead, kick, and snare first. It's kind of like the parallel that I talked about a second ago, where you've got 2 different things. You pick your most important stuff and then let the other stuff kind of fall in under there. A lot of this is because drums have a lot of bleed, so you're leaving your cymbal and your toms off until you get the overhead, the kick, and the snare. You may have all the cymbals and toms you need, and so you don't have to bring up those other 2 levels, and you get a tighter mix of the drum sound as a result. Okay, how to stay on course. So you got your raw tracks, you get them to an adequate mix, and then you make sure that mix is both distinctive and stable. So what does that mean? First of all, you're dropping the idea of the perfect mix. You're getting to an adequate mix, which means you don't have problems with the mix. You've got your phasing issues, if they exist, taken care of. You've got the relative levels set. All the instruments kind of have their neighborhood, so you've carved out EQ space for them. Some of them need to be linked up, so there's some overlap of EQ. So you get all of that too, so that it's there aren't problems. And then you want to make sure that it's distinctive. So the track has got to stand out somehow. So you've got to work on that focal point some more. Maybe the drums or the vocals need some smoke on them, or a little bit of kind of dazzle on the high end, stand out. Whatever that is, that comes back to your plan of how we're going to attack this mix. Stability, so it's got to be distinctive, so you make sure your focal point's standing out. In terms of stability, you want to make sure it's stable across multiple listening environments, speakers, and sound systems. So, the famous thing of what we always did, you get the thing sounding as well as you can in the studio, walk next door to the kind of chill out room, the green room in the studio. There's a stereo in there, listen to it, then go out into the parking lot, pull it up on the car stereo system. You should do that with as many things as you can, and in different rooms and listening spaces, so that how this thing is going to behave, because everything sounds different in every different space. You should have 2 or 3 different sets of monitoring speakers in your actual, in your studio, at home studio or otherwise. You want earphones, you want some nice expensive monitors, and you want some little crappy monitors, so you get that sense of what's happening. Okay. When it comes down to, this fine tuning thing, so iterative fine tuning means that, you're going to start with like major ballpark adjustments, large scale approximations, getting stuff into the ballpark, and then you fine tune a little bit with smaller adjustments on each subsequent pass. Now, so what's a pass? So a pass is you start with the faders, you're pulling everything into, approximate sort of relationship in terms just of the gain. So it's gain structure. What's loud, what's soft. Drums sound good, voice needs to be louder. So get your faders going. And then you want to decide, so that's your sort of vertical dimension. We talked about 3-dimensional recording on that first assignment, the listening assignment. And then you want to pan. So now you're looking at the horizon, left, right, straight ahead. Where do you want to position? So you close your eyes, imagine the sound stage if you're seeing them live or whatever it is. It's one way to do it. There are many, be creative there, but everywhere should have it's all the instruments need to have their place. And speaking of place, frequency range is a big one. So, you want to carve up the frequency spectrum from 20 hertz to 20,000 hertz. From the lowest lows you can hear all the way up to the super highest trebles. All your instruments should be able to stake a claim of territory within that, so you don't have too much overlap, but just a little bit on the edges will make it sound right for strategic choices like kick drum and bass guitar, for example. Then you do your modulators, a chorus or like a flange. Then you go to your effects last. And so that's a pass. And so you do that, get everything sort of kind of in there, and then you listen a little bit more closely, and you listen in the groups, and you do that pass again, and you make finer adjustments. You may just keep going on this, and that's the problem, right? So this can go on potentially forever, and you can lose your mind actually, or wear your ears out and stop being, get it to the point where you can't tell what's happening anymore. Make sure you don't overuse the solo button either. A little bit here and there is okay, but let the mix guide you. How do things fit in the mix? So take as many passes as you need or until you hit deadlock. So what is deadlock? Deadlock is when you can't, it's like writer's block, right? You can't go anymore. So either because of burnout, you will get to the point where your ears lose the ability to differentiate. And it's like, you'd be like, I can't hear anymore, that kind of hitting that wall will come later and later with more practice, but it happens to everybody and it is not fun. So you got to be sensitive to that. You're dealing with a sensitive organ on that feeds right into your brain. So watch for that, take breaks as you need. And when you come back, that's when you want to start back with low volume and kind of ease into it. Now you will also hit the major block, which is, you've been working for a while, but you're gonna, a few days even, or maybe a week. I'd say a week to 10 days is what we used to spend on an album, and that's very, very fast. But the style of music we were doing lent itself to that because there was a lot of bleed and stuff. But we would get in, we'd do that first mix, or we'd get to the point where we were feeling kind of burnt out on it, and we'd be like, we got to get out of this whole thing for like 4 or 5 days, or maybe a full week, and then listen to it with fresh ears. And it is amazing, that process right there. So that's what's called the critical break. How long should you spend on your mix? We used to spend 2 or 3 hours to a day or two, really a few hours for us doing that, roots music stuff was good for one song. So that's how we could get through an album in a week. Now, if you're doing different kinds of genres that are more complex, have high resolution, a lot of detail, you may spend a couple days. I would say a day max on a tune. To me personally, I couldn't imagine spending that much time on a tune. But like I said, we're all different. We all have our own styles. So benefits, we talked about not obsessing. So you got to know when to kind of step back, let the mix go, because the more mixes you do, the more you can learn and the faster you're going to improve. So it's best not to obsess. Okay, adequate is good. In terms of your target, you want to clean it up, make sure there's no problems. Remember that the best mixes, the mixing engineer would love to have another few hours and then another few hours, and it's just they never would let it go. We talked about you can't polish a turd. Mixing as a remedy to problems, mixing can fix some stuff, so you can modify arrangements. You can add elements that support the arrangement. Famously, Us and Them by Pink Floyd has that delayed right on the beat. Us, 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 us. And so that's a modified sort of, that's a supporting element to the existing arrangement. You're not going to create talented musicians. You can reduce how untalented they sound, however. Drummers can't play on the beat, or singers who can't play in pitch. Like, there are tools to deal with all of that stuff. It's just a matter of how much time you want to spend. Okay, so you've got it adequate. How do you leave it for the mastering engineer? You've got it adequate. What is it? It's got to be adequate, and it needs to be exciting, and it needs to be, what was that last thing? So distinctive, cleaned up, distinctive, and then there's one other thing that it has to be, and I can't go backwards on my thing, so I actually forgot. But you get to that, you get satisfied to the point where you're ready to pass this mix on down the line to the mastering engineer. They don't want the endings to be faded, so leave those just hanging. That'll sound weird, but that's part of their job. You want to leave about 15% of the available headroom unused. Mastering engineers hate it when they get songs that are jacked up with the to the roof, and all you see is almost like a solid black line when you look at the waveform in the the editing window. That's you're taking their job away from them, and you're giving them a headache. They really don't have a lot to work with in that. So they're in charge of bringing that last, it's like a flower that's coming into blossom. That last 15% is the coming into full blossom. And they really are remarkable craftspeople when you see when the correct mastering is done to it, something that's been well recorded, well performed, well written, well mixed. That mastering engineer puts that last bit of polish on there, and it is just so powerful and beautiful. You want to make sure you use WAV files to pass to them unless they require or request something else. And then don't modify bit depth resolution or your sample rate or anything like that. So you're going to give it to them as original as possible on those respect. WAV files, resolution and sample rate, and then leave the headroom for them to work within, and then the endings as well. All right. It's a little bit long, but that is for week 2, and we will be talking later.